The diamonds sewn into their corsets were meant to buy their freedom, but instead, they turned into a suit of armor that deflected the first wave of bullets, prolonging their agony. In the suffocating air of a basement in Yekaterinburg, the shimmering wealth of the world's most powerful dynasty became, well, a cruel death trap. Imagine the scene, a room no larger than a standard bedroom, crowded with 11 people, filled with the acrid stench of gunpowder and the deafening echoes of gunfire. You see, for 300 years, the Romanov name was synonymous with absolute power, golden palaces, and a divine right to rule. They were the sun around which the Russian Empire orbited. But on this humid July night in 1918, that sun was being extinguished in the most brutal way possible. Now, these weren't just political figures being erased from history. No, they were a family. A father who had once commanded millions, a mother who lived for her children, and 5 young siblings who had spent their lives shielded by the walls of the Windsor Palace. They believed until the very last second that they were merely posing for a photograph before being moved to a safer location. Instead, they found themselves staring into the barrels of pistols held by men who hated everything they represented. How did the rulers of 1/6 of the earth end up huddled together in a Siberian cellar? How did a lineage of emperors and empresses who once held the power of life and death over 100 million souls find themselves so utterly alone? This is more than a political execution. It is the visceral, chaotic collapse of an era. We are about to go inside those final 24 hours to witness the tragic transformation of the Romanovs from the peak of imperial gold to the cold weight of lead. This is the end of the line. This is the fall of the House of Romanov. Close your eyes and just try to picture it. Not the damp, suffocating basement in Yekaterinburg, but the world as it used to be. The Winter Palace, where the air shimmered with the scent of lilies and the soft rustle of silk against marble. Nicholas II, the man who believed he was God's anointed instrument on earth, once stood at the very center of a court that dripped in diamonds and gold. You see, he was a man who inherited the map of an empire that spanned 11 time zones, a ruler whose very word could move mountains and shift the tides of global power. But time is a cruel architect. Heavy-hearted, by the summer of 1918, the palaces were nothing more than ghosts of a lost civilization. Pointedly, the Romanovs were no longer sovereigns of a sprawling empire. They were prisoners of the Ipatiev House, a building the Bolsheviks mockingly dubbed the House of Special Purpose. The contrast, it's enough to break your heart, really. Pained, Empress Alexandra, a woman who once wore crowns of pearls that weighed heavy on her brow, now spent her days scrubbing the rough, unfinished floorboards of her prison. Her hands, once soft and adorned with royal rings, were raw and chapped. Wistfully, the grand dukes and princesses, who had spent their childhoods in nursery suites filled with porcelain dolls and French tutors, now shared cramped rooms, listening to the guttural shouts of their guards just beyond the thin walls. Yet there is a mystery that lingers in the historical record, a question that historians have debated for over a century. Why was there such an eerie, unnerving calm? Throughout those final, sweltering weeks in Yekaterinburg, the family did not collapse into hysterics. They did not rail against the injustice of their fate. They held their heads high, maintaining the rituals of their faith, reading aloud to one another, and walking with the dignity of those who felt the crown was still resting on their heads. They acted as if this was merely a temporary humiliation, a storm they were destined to weather. The truth is, they were waiting. Secret messages had been smuggled into the house, whispers of a rescue mission, of loyalist forces moving through the Siberian wilderness to spirit them away to safety. They truly believed that the world they had lost was about to be restored by a sudden, decisive strike. But while they held on to the fragile thread of that hope, a much darker plan was being finalized just outside their door. We know the tragedy of how it ended, but what if I told you that the rescue mission they believed in wasn't just a fantasy? It was a gamble that failed for the most calculated of reasons. To understand the tragedy that was about to unfold in the dark basement of the Ipatiev House, we truly have to understand the man who wore the crown. You see, Nicholas II was a man of profound and often painful contradictions. History often paints him as a weak-willed tyrant, but the reality is perhaps more tragic. Softly, he was a man who never wanted to be a king. He was a devoted father, a lover of the quiet countryside, and a soul who would have been perfectly content as a simple country gentleman. But instead, he was thrust onto the throne of a crumbling empire, burdened by a divine right he felt he couldn't abandon, even as the world around him burned. Somberly, beside him stood Alexandra, a woman whose life was defined by a desperate, agonizing love. To the Russian people, she was the cold, German-born outsider. But inside these walls, she was just a mother, terrified for the life of her only son, Alexei. You know, the young Tsarevich carried the royal disease, hemophilia, a condition that meant a simple bruise could be a death sentence. It was this maternal terror that drove her into the arms of the mystic Grigory Rasputin. She believed he was the only one who could stop her son's bleeding, a belief that shattered the Romanovs' reputation and tethered the very fate of the monarchy to a mad monk. Quietly, while Nicholas and Alexandra sat in their dimly lit room, sipping tea and reminiscing about the golden days of Peterhof, the man who would end their story was pacing the hallway just a few feet away. Yakov Yurovsky was the polar opposite of the Romanovs' fading elegance, a former watchmaker with a cold, clinical mind. You see, Yurovsky didn't see a family before him. He saw a biological contagion. To the Bolsheviks, the Romanov bloodline was a virus, one that had to be eradicated to ensure the revolution could survive. The atmosphere in the house shifted right when a telegram arrived from Moscow. The orders were clear, signed in the ruthless ink of the Soviet leadership. The white loyalist armies were getting too close. The Romanovs were no longer just prisoners, they were a liability, one that needed to be liquidated. As the family shared a quiet moment of domestic peace, oblivious to the wolf at their door, Yurovsky was checking his pistol and organizing his squad. He was a man of precision, and he wanted this procedure to be final. The tea was finished. The sun began to set on the Romanov dynasty for the very last time. But as the family prepared for bed, believing they were simply waiting for another day of exile, Yurovsky was already choosing the room where their blood would meet the floor. However, there was one detail everyone missed, a secret hidden within the girl's clothing that would turn a quick execution into a waking nightmare. Inside the heavy stone walls of the Ipatiev House, well, the air was thick, you see, thick with a strange, suffocating hope. For weeks, the Romanovs had been living a double life. To their guards, they were just defeated prisoners, but in the shadows of those private rooms, they were conspirators. They had been receiving secret letters, smuggled in through bread crusts and laundry, signed by a mysterious figure known only as the Officer. This man claimed to lead a group of loyalists, a white army cell poised to storm the house and whisk the Tsar and his family away to safety. On this final afternoon, Nicholas sat near the window, just listening. In the distance, the low rumble of artillery echoed through the Ural Mountains. To anyone else, it was the sound of a closing trap. But to Nicholas, well, it was the symphony of salvation. He truly believed his cousins, his generals, and his people were finally coming to break those doors down. The family spent those last hours in a state of quiet grace. They played cards, they read aloud to one another, and they prayed. Alexandra, though plagued by physical pain, found a renewed strength. You see, they weren't just waiting for the end of the day, they were waiting for the beginning of their new lives. They spoke in whispers about where they might go, perhaps England, or perhaps back to the sun-drenched coasts of the Crimea. This strategy of hope was the only thing keeping the darkness of their prison at bay. But the tragedy of the Romanovs is not just in their death, no, it is in the cold-blooded cruelty of their deception. You see, the officer did not exist. The letters, written in elegant, respectful French, were not the work of a loyal monarchist. They were the work of Peter Voykov, a local Bolshevik leader with a penchant for psychological warfare. It was a sting operation, a Machiavellian test to see if the Tsar still harbored dreams of restoration. Tragically, every time Nicholas replied to those letters, every time he discussed escape routes or signaled his readiness to flee, he was unknowingly signing his own death warrant. The Bolsheviks needed to know if the family would remain a rallying point for the counter-revolution. By clinging to the hope of rescue, Nicholas proved that as long as he breathed, the Soviet flame was at risk. The test was over. The Bolsheviks had seen enough. The family's belief in a miracle had provided their captors with the final justification they needed for the procedure. As the clock struck midnight and the family was ushered toward the basement, they still didn't realize the trap had closed. They believed they were being moved for their own protection, you know. They thought the rescue was finally here. Little did they know, their final defense wasn't an army, but the very jewels they had sewn into their corsets, a secret that was about to turn a quick execution into a waking nightmare. The air in the Ipatiev House, well, it was thick with a stillness that only comes before a storm. At midnight, the silence was shattered by a knock on the door. Yakov Yurovsky, the family's jailer, delivered the final, calculated lie. He told them the White Army was closing in, that the streets were no longer safe, and they must descend to the semi-basement for their own protection. Nicholas, ever the father and protector, you see, he did not hesitate. Softly, he gathered his frail 13-year-old son, Alexei, into his arms. The boy was too weak to walk, his body ravaged by the hemophilia that had defined their tragic reign. Behind them followed the Empress Alexandra, her 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and their 4 most loyal servants. 11 people, once the masters of the largest empire on earth, were now being led like cattle into a subterranean cage. The room was tiny, barely 12 by 15 feet. Its walls were bare and whitewashed, illuminated only by a single dim electric light. Observant, Alexandra, ever the aristocrat even in the face of death, noted there were no chairs. She asked for 2. Yurovsky complied, and for a few fleeting moments, the family sat in the heavy silence of the basement, waiting for a transport carriage they believed would take them to safety. They were waiting for a rescue, you see. They were met with a firing squad. The door swung open, and Yurovsky returned, not with news of a carriage, but with 11 armed men. Authoritatively, he stepped forward and read a brief, cold sentence. In view of the fact that your relatives are continuing their attack on Soviet Russia, the Earl Executive Committee has decided to execute you. Nicholas turned, his face a mask of pure disbelief. What? What? He stammered, shielding his son. He never got his answer. The room exploded. In an instant, the air was choked with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the deafening roar of Browning pistols. Nicholas was the first to fall, killed instantly by a volley of lead. But for the rest of the family, the nightmare was only beginning. As the smoke thickened, making it near impossible to see, a terrifying realization dawned on the executioners. Baffled, the bullets, they were bouncing off the Romanov daughters. The lead was ricocheting around the room like lethal hailstones. For 20 agonizing minutes, the basement became a chaotic hellscape of screams and shadows. The gold of the Romanov Empire, the millions in diamonds and pearls they had sewn into their corsets for safekeeping, was now acting as a suit of armor, refusing to let them die. But what the family intended as a lifeline for their future had become a curse that would make their final moments a waking horror. And yet, as the dust began to settle and the triggers grew cold, the executioners realized their grisly work was far from over. There was one detail everyone had missed, a final heartbeat in the rubble that would spark a mystery lasting 100 years. The guns were silent, but you see, the nightmare was only entering its second act. Under the cover of the indigo Siberian night, the heavy iron doors of the Ipatiev House swung open. A single Fiat truck rumbled in the courtyard, its engine a low growl against the unnatural silence of Yekaterinburg. The bodies of the Romanovs, once the most powerful family on earth, were now nothing more than, well, a problem to be solved. They were tossed into the back of the truck like unwanted cargo, wrapped in cheap felt blankets to soak up the evidence of what had just transpired. Yakov Yurovsky, the man who had orchestrated the carnage, he knew that killing a Tsar was one thing, but erasing a god king, that was another. You see, to the millions of monarchists across Russia, these bodies were not just flesh, no, they were holy relics. If a grave were found, it would become a shrine, a place for the White Army to gather and find the strength to crush the revolution. The Romanovs couldn't just be dead. They had to disappear from the face of the earth. The truck labored through the muddy, jagged tracks of the Koptyaki forest until it reached a desolate spot known as the Four Brothers Mine. In the flickering light of torches, the scene turned from a tragedy into a desecration. The sisters' clothing was sliced away with bayonets, spilling the last of the diamonds into the dirt, the very gems that had failed to save them. Then came the acid. To ensure that no face could be recognized and no bone could ever be identified, the executioners doused the remains in jugs of sulfuric acid. The bodies were then cast into a shallow, waterlogged pit and covered with dirt and railroad ties. As the earth was shoveled over them, you see, the Bolsheviks believed they had buried the Romanov name forever. The next morning, the official word went out to the world. Nicholas Romanov has been executed. His family has been moved to a safe location. It was a calculated, cold-blooded lie. By claiming the Tsarina and the children were still alive, the new regime kept the public in a state of confused hope, preventing an immediate uprising from those who still loved the monarchy. You know, silence is a fertile ground for ghosts. Because the world never saw the bodies, and because the Bolsheviks refused to tell the truth, a haunting question began to echo across the continents. Did any of them escape? Within years, women began emerging from the shadows of Europe, claiming to be the Grand Duchess Anastasia. The most famous of them, Anna Anderson, she would spend her entire life insisting she was the lost princess, providing details only a Romanov could know, and haunting the surviving relatives for decades.
The tragedy in the basement had created a mystery that would fascinate the world for nearly a century. But as the decades passed and the Soviet Union guarded its secrets with iron fists, a new question emerged. If the family was truly gone, why were the executioners so terrified of the spot where they had been buried? Because buried beneath the Siberian mud was a secret that even the most powerful men in Moscow were afraid to dig up. A secret that suggested the executioners' work wasn't as final as they believed. The secret buried in that Siberian forest, well, it wasn't just a collection of bones. It was the ghost of an era that simply refused to stay buried. For decades, you see, the Soviet Union tried to scrub the Romanovs from the map of human memory, turning their palaces into museums and their execution site into nothing more than a vacant lot. But they learned a bitter truth. You can execute a family, but you cannot execute a memory. When we look back at the Romanovs today, we must look past the crown jewels and the grand titles. We have to look at the faces of the children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and the young Alexei. In those final, terrifying moments in that basement, they weren't symbols of a crumbling autocracy or icons of some lost age. They were simply a family, right? Huddled together in the dark, victims of a world shifting violently on its axis. Their story is the ultimate testament to the fragility of human greatness. It serves as a haunting reminder that power is nothing more than a fragile garment, easily torn and even more easily stripped away. The Romanovs are the proof that the world can turn from gold to lead in the absolute blink of an eye. One moment, you are the most powerful man on earth, believed to be appointed by God himself. The next, you are nameless dust in a shallow, muddy grave. It took the total collapse of the very empire that killed them for the truth to finally surface. It wasn't until the fall of the Soviet Union that their remains were identified, their names restored to the light, and their bodies finally laid at rest with the dignity they were denied back in 1918. But while their bones are now at peace, the lesson of the House of Special Purpose remains etched into the very stones of history. It forces us to look at our own world with a much more critical eye. History is a relentless cycle of rise and fall, of arrogance and consequence. As we look at the titans of our modern age, or the empires that today seem far too big to ever fail, we have to wonder, don't we? What other powers are sitting in their own house of special purpose right now, completely unaware that the clock is ticking? If this journey into the final hours of the Romanovs resonated with you, well, then subscribe to Story History and join our community as we uncover the lives of the figures who shaped our world. Before you go, I really want to hear from you in the comments. Do you believe the fall of the Romanovs was an inevitable tide of history, or was it a tragedy that could have been avoided? Thank you for watching.